We are joined now, I'm pleased to be joined by Max Wessel, who is Chief Innovation Officer at SAP and happens to be a former favorite student of Clayton Christensen. They worked together on many projects over the years, but I'm delighted to have Max bringing us his own views and perspective on the mighty topic of ethics in technology innovation. Max, welcome to our symposium.
Thanks, Karen. It's a delight to be here virtually.
Virtually, exactly, and as all things must be these days. So it's a weighty topic, and your article addressed it before we even knew we were in a time of kind of a morass of ethics, I'm going to say. But let's tell the audience a little bit about the core concept at play in your article.
Absolutely. I would say that the article itself started off that it's important to understand the genesis. The core concept started when I observed with my co-author, Nicole Helmer, that in the Bay Area, at a minimum, there were cars zipping down the street that effectively were driving themselves. And there was a great deal of caution as that technology was rolled out as to how we dealt with some of the more moral issues associated with these multi-ton vehicles barreling down the road. And the fact that there was all of this impending crisis that was physical, it was real, it was visceral. You walk across the street and you actually care how a autonomous vehicle is taking a decision, whether to stop, veer off in another direction or not. We were juxtaposing that level of caution to what was occurring in many different industries, where we were seeing a decomposition of what I would say or characterize as moral obligation or ethical obligation. And instead, what we'd seen emerging was effectively sort of moral or regulatory apathy. Innovation for innovation's sake that was coming to decompose a given business, to topple, to disrupt, to do whatever it is to recreate the world in a vision that is simpler, cheaper, more accessible, but without necessarily regard for some of the ethical conundrum that we find ourselves in. And so a couple of years ago, we started thinking about what was the source of change that was occurring across the sort of global economic environment. What was the driving factor and what were the risks that emerged? And we saw one trend come again and again, which was the internet gave way to increasing modularity in our value chains. Years ago, Clay spent a lot of time writing about the theory of interdependence and modularity. As I will characterize very simply, when something is a difficult technical challenge, we tend to approach it with an interdependent design. We tightly control all of the components of a given system to ensure that we can deliver the utmost performance. The example here that's a classic is the iPhone. When we had the emergence of the smartphone tightly controlling the components that were used in a given system, the screen to the chips to the hardware case and microphone, even what you saw with the early antenna design, sometimes that led to poor call quality, etc. That interdependent architecture was critical to deliver performance. But as connections are standardized, it becomes a lot easier to break apart systems. And what we saw in the last 2 decades with the proliferation of the internet was that the connections were standardized across a variety of industries, whether it was firing off a standard CAD file to go to a 3D printing shop somewhere in the world to print an industrial grade component, whether it was figuring out how to incorporate financial documentation to provide lending or underwriting services, whether it was as simple as making an algorithmic bid on an advertisement, whether it was through Google or through Facebook, etc. So the internet gave way to an immense amount of standardization that allowed value chains to be broken apart faster than we've ever seen them before. And what we saw is a great deal of opportunity for innovation. It's as a user, when you have a plethora of choice, you get exactly what you want. But the problem that we saw in the core of the article is that as users choose, they choose for themselves. They don't take into account some of the societal negative externalities, the costs, the burdens that we put on people. And we saw increasing examples of the number of times companies were bringing users the choice they want, at the expense of the societal kind of need. And in fact, we saw this in a juxtaposition of short-term desires versus long-term benefit to users. Because users tend, everyone who's paying attention in this symposium is cognitively biased. And we tend to reward ourselves in the short term at the expense of some of our long-term needs. And so what we realized through this exploration, and the heart of the article, is what you can do as an organization to put yourself in the role of standard bearer, to instead of imagining just what you can do to break apart the value chain and enable that choice, how do you protect yourself against some of the costs you may impose on people in the future?
So Max, let me break down some of what you just talked about, just to make sure the audience is following with us here. So the original example you gave, which was the one that kind of spurred your thinking, was the automated driverless cars. So what you're talking about is the creators of automated cars, driverless cars, have to make programming choices, right? In this situation, do I try to save the driver, or do I try to save the pedestrian? They have to imagine every scenario and make moral value judgments about choice A, choice B, choice C of what will happen in a certain scenario. Is that what you're talking about? For that, the producer of that car gets to make that choice. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah, that is what I'm referring to. And also the fact that because driving is such a visceral experience and it is so regulated and we understand the cost so directly, that we are thoughtful about it right now. Whereas if you take another example that we put on the table in the course of the article, was 3D printing with home consumer grade 3D printers, where when we brought things like MakerBot to the market, we were targeting, frankly, a market that was underserved, that was not well understood. It turns out that the MakerBot that we brought to bear was also perfectly capable of printing a 3D gun. Didn't work all the time, but we hadn't, unlike with the automotive industry, where we had been very thoughtful about how we prepare for that future. In a lot of other industries where we see the value chain break apart and power to make decisions put in hands of new constituents, we hadn't been thoughtful about what those changes would require.
So why is this seemingly an increasing problem right now? Why are we thinking about this now more than ever? Is it the speed of innovation? Is it the speed of things going from interdependent to modular? What's making this so relevant right now?
If you look at the connectedness of our world, which will only grow with the introduction of technologies like 5G coming and making networking, speed of communication even more prolific. If you look at the embrace of open source innovation to drive standards into communities and power into the hands of innovators, you are seeing a compounding speed of innovation, a compounding speed of modularity being brought to different industries. So I think it is an increasingly important topic, but it is also one where I think it is increasingly important because we often as a society value the short-term gain, even in the way we talk about innovation. Relative to the impending costs. And I'll give you a very specific example that's in the news right now. But we have Google and Apple partnering around an API to do tracing and tracking of individuals. And by the way, in the COVID crisis, it's a great response, right? That we have two technology giants that own operating systems coming forward and thinking about how they could expose this data. But absolutely, before we put those APIs into work, we need to think about the privacy implications. What happens when you open this Pandora's box? And that's where we cannot separate technology innovation from ethical and moral considerations.
Well, let me be devil's advocate for a moment. Why should I care about it? I'm providing a product or a service that people need. I can do it in a modular way. I've helped somebody do something, right? In this case, I've helped potentially save lives by playing a role in contact tracing. Why do I, as the company, have that moral or ethical responsibility? I'm part of a much bigger universe. Why am I supposed to be taking the lead on this?
There is real business risk to absolving yourself of responsibility on an ongoing basis, because the risk in the long term is that you become regulated, or frankly, consumers lose trust in you entirely. There are lots of companies that have enabled, for instance, algorithmic underwriting of individuals that have broken apart the insurance or financial system stack and made it easier for people to get access to credit or payments. If you happen to be the company that has made it easier to generate subprime mortgages, and you've just provided the algorithm and people have put it into use in many, many abhorrent ways, and that causes a financial crisis, nobody really cares what your terms and conditions said. And that's where I think business leaders fall into this short-term trap of, if you believe in anomalous events, it actually matters how you behave in the long term and how you put yourself in a position to protect yourself over the long term. In the article, we mentioned the example of Anne Wojcicki at 23andMe. And 23andMe got into, was the first genetic testing company to see kind of increased FDA attention around its treatment of data and how it provides recommendations to its users. What I would say with 23andMe is the fact that they had been very, very proactive around this topic, building an advisory board that counseled them on how they use, in the same way an academic institution, how they would have, they counseled them on how they should and could use the data that was within their systems, made it much easier to deal with the regulatory authority and to justify to their consumers that they were acting in a beneficial way, both from a societal perspective and for their end users. And I think that confidence, that precaution, that has lent itself to a longer term success than they could have sustained without that sort of ethical lens in place.
Does that disrupt the speed of innovation? And are there consequences for companies who might want to do it, but we need to get to market faster, or we can't wait for all of this to become apparent? Is there a negative that comes with taking that kind of personal responsibility as a company?
There is a negative and there's an opportunity. Every headwind is also a tailwind. I would say that in an era where we think about privacy more and the importance of journalistic integrity, the folks who were, the folks who were at the forefront of figuring out how to bring high quality content with integrity to the market in a digital environment benefited in the wake of many of the scandals surrounding, for instance, Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. And so if you believe that in the long term, this is sort of the Benjamin Graham statement, in the long term, the market is a weighing machine, in the short term, it's a voting machine. In the long term, if we think these ethical issues will come to light, you have an advantage by being a company that is taking a position, then the right position in the market. And I would say Apple has benefited from this in the last few years in an enormous way. They've been investing in privacy protecting technology for their users when it comes to tracking, storage of information, consumption of content. And what you saw is potentially for 3 to 5 years, their transition to cloud services was slowed relative to some of their competition. But in the wake of many of the scandals that emerged, they became their users' best defender, and people started to respect and reward them for that.
That's a very good point, actually, because that is clearly their brand at this point, and that's probably even more valuable now than it would have been 5 years ago for them. Is it ever too late? Can you make, if your company has not taken this initiative, has not sort of tried to shape the conversation about the ethics of technology in your area, can you become a leader after the fact? Can you organize with other industry leaders? What can you do if you haven't had the forethought to do this?
I think it is more of a question of varying degrees of difficulty. Obviously, if you have legacy and you've made investments in things that are potentially questionable on the long term in terms of how you have leaned in or avoided certain kind of moral issues, it becomes more challenging, but it's never too late. if you imagine yourself as the standard bearer and you adapt to that world, it is possible to make change. And I would argue, if you look at the way, for instance, Uber has changed under Dara, and the way they have thought much more holistically about their role in the ecosystem, how they can support their drivers, how they should enable choice, the types of things they bring to the table, that change arguably happened far too late in their process of maturation, but it happened. And that change was necessary. Had they not done it, you would have seen far, far more backlash from their user base.
Right. That's a great example, actually, because I think they could have tumbled really from their lack of doing that, and catching up quickly now probably is part of an important survival strategy. Speaking of survival, let me ask you this, Max. How does this play out in the current COVID crisis? It may sound like nice to do, nice to have, nice things if business were normal, if life were normal, but right now we're trying to keep the world, connected and alive. How does this play out, and how important is it now when we're in this extraordinary circumstance?
I'll say two things, and this is where I get to put on my hat of my day job to some extent, which is managing 5,000 people at an organization that is going through much of this change at the moment and dealing with this on an ongoing basis. And I'll say the same thing that I say to them, which is, yes, this time is challenging, but the world will continue to turn, the sun will continue to rise, and we will certainly have an economy that will be reshaped through this crisis, but we will have it in 2 years, in 3 years, in 4 years, in 5 years. And so we need to keep in perspective that our principles matter now as much as they'll matter in the future. And in fact, it's when things are challenging, when we have to defend those core beliefs around human behavior and our respect for consumers, our advocacy against exploitation. All of those things are more critical now than they will be in the future, because it's easier to fall victim today under pressure to the desire for quick and simple solutions. And it's often very difficult to roll back against the cost. And we talk about surveillance as a big issue. And I'm glad that there are still people who are out there doing advocacy on behalf of personal privacy, that we're thinking about things like how we use the current crisis to reform our economy in appreciation of, for instance, employees who shouldn't have a lack of labor protections in many situations that they're experiencing right now. And so I would argue it is harder today, but more important that we keep these topics central as we think about what our response is and how we build the economy we aspire to live in over the next 2 to 3 years.
Does this need to be a collaboration with government and regulation in some way, or is this important to be ahead of that coming along?
The pace of innovation is outpacing our ability to regulate preemptively. And the pace of innovation is outpacing government so much that where there was limited risk on waiting for government before because the experiments would be small, now you have an experiment that is successful that turns into a global phenomenon in a matter of days or weeks. And I think that change took us from a posture of being able to wait on government to reach out to us to one where we have to be proactively engaged, and we need to be thinking about the institutions that we should work with. I'll mention a section mate of mine from business school started a company called Everlywell, and she was the first at-home lab testing company to secure a COVID test. And to her credit, proactively worked with the FDA to figure out how these should be rolled out. And instead of releasing them to consumers as the rest of her business operated, she figured out a way to distribute them to healthcare workers at the front line. If she weren't proactively working with regulatory institutions around this, because she knew this was the right type of issue to address, she would have taken a different decision. And arguably, she could have taken a different decision that would have put the business at risk. So I would say for anybody who's driving innovation, you shouldn't allow this to slow you down indefinitely, but you should absolutely be proactive, seeking opinion, understanding the regulatory environment, partnering with government and public institutions, and doing so for the best interest of, of society, of your consumers, of your end customers.
So Max, you mentioned the founder of the company. Whose job is it to be aware of, thinking of ahead of all of the ethical issues that could be coming down the line with innovation? Is it at the top leadership of the company? Is it in the innovation team? Who is supposed to be monitoring and thinking about this before it becomes an issue?
If I return to the example, and it's not an insider view, but more of the pop culture view of Uber, I would say it's impossible to have a ethical or moral standing on how a company should operate if it's not pervasive across the company. I don't think there is a person at Apple that doesn't understand Apple's policy on privacy and who owns the data that their devices generate. Because decisions are amplified all over. Now, that does not absolve us, and this is where all respect to Professor Porter, I would say, that does not absolve the CEO from being anything other than the most important strategic stakeholder. And so with Julia at Everlywell, I think it was critically important that she were involved, but I think you have to have a culture where those questions are escalated, and that it is okay to talk about those issues on a long-term basis where people understand your risks, your principle, and your perspective.
So what kinds of people would be on an advisory board for a company? Just give me a range of the types of external perspectives that would be helpful.
Members of NGOs, academics, experienced leaders from industry. It really depends on the type of issue you're dealing with. So for us, we have a lot of focus on AI and data privacy. So we have experts in machine learning, in security and analytics, these types of issues, because we're trying to attack one of the core issues that face what we believe to be our industry. Now, if you were in healthcare, you would have a very different set of external stakeholders dealing with some of the issues that you could imagine face you. In the article, we talk about imagining you become the standard bearer as a disruptor or an innovator inside of a large organization. And I think what you really need to do is say, imagine you become the standard bearer, and imagine the perspectives that society would require of you in that environment. It's easy for the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal to understand who plays a role in their ecosystem because they've been doing it for 75 years. For the Facebooks of the world that are building the next generation of media empire, when you're on your upward trajectory, it would help to think about, okay, what were the types of perspectives that came in to advise the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and how do we build an advisory board that gets us some of that insight without necessarily being the subject of regulatory scrutiny right now or existing processes?
I think that's one of the most important points for a private sector audience is get ahead of the regulatory scrutiny. Be the standard bearer, and you'll watch that you shape how things are judged and valued and viewed in terms of ethics. And I think that's almost one of the biggest ROI arguments of your piece, which is you don't want to wait for it to be imposed upon you. You want to lead it. And when you're in the position of leading, that's the strongest ROI I think you can imagine for yourself.
It allows you to chart your own course.
Exactly.
And that is a much better position to be in.
So any parting thoughts for our audience in this era that might feel very Wild West-y right now of survival and quick solutions and just good enough and elbowing each other out of the way for market share? Any pearls of wisdom to make sure people don't lose sight of how important this is?
Only that people will have a long memory about the good that we do and the corners we cut through this process. And so I think the good news for all of the folks in the audience, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector is people are interested in helping, and we're all looking for solutions, and creativity should abound in our new world. So just be conscious of the way in which you deploy that creativity.
Thanks, Max. I think it's a really important article. I'm so happy that you wrote it, and I think it's more important than ever right now because it would be very easy for that to get swept aside in this era. And I think, as you say, people have a very long memory, and I recommend the article to all of our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to hand you back over to Paul Michaelman. Thanks, Max. Take care.
All right. Bye.